Hi, it's Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au, and I want to give you a snapshot of what's happening in markets around Australia based on the findings that are published in the new winter edition of the Price Predictor Index, which is a quarterly report that we publish based on sales volumes patterns. We get raw data for every location around Australia, every town, every suburb, and we look at the patterns that are shown by sales volumes, how many houses and apartments are selling in each location. Because what we know to be true from the more than 30 years that I've spent researching and writing about residential real estate in Australia is that sales volumes dictate price patterns in simple terms, all other things being equal. In locations where there's a pattern of rising sales activity, price growth inevitably will follow. And it also happens in reverse, that locations where there is a decline in sales activity are likely to see an end to price growth or possibly, in some cases, a price decline. So what's happening around Australia according to the winter edition of the Price Predictor Index, which we published only yesterday? The first thing is that, not surprisingly, the latest information confirms what media has been telling us about the decline in Sydney and Melbourne. In fact, we've actually seen that pattern happening in both Sydney and Melbourne in terms of the number of sales happening. We've actually been seeing it over the last couple of years. We've been predicting the end of price growth in those markets ahead of time because that's what this exercise allows us to do. So the winter survey confirms that, not that we really needed that because media keeps telling us about it to the exclusion of one of the things. What media is not telling us about is all the other things that are happening in markets around Australia. They've extrapolated the Sydney and Melbourne situation to the whole nation, and they're talking about prices declining across Australia, and it simply is not the case. There are some very, very strongly rising markets in Australia, and those are revealed by this research. Right now, the most notably active capital city market is Adelaide. Adelaide's a very solid market, far more important than most people realise, very much the most underrated market in capital city Australia. Very buoyant and active, and at the beginnings, I think, of a price cycle. As Sydney and Melbourne wind down, some of the smaller cities are cranking up. Adelaide is one of them. And one of the signals that that market might be rising in terms of delivering greater price growth than we've seen in recent years is that the top end of that market is delivering pretty strong price growth. In fact, that's one of the trends that's come out of this latest research for the winter edition of the Price Predictor Index, that in a couple of our cities, which we think are at the beginning of a growth cycle, the top end suburbs have had very, very strong price growth. We've seen it in Adelaide in the last 12 months, and we've seen it in Perth. Why is that so? Because residential property markets are primarily dictated by what's happening in the local economy, not the national economy, not by the level of interest rates so much, not by national economic trends, because we have so many different situations. We've had a very strong economy in New South Wales, also in Victoria, but a very weak economy in places like Western Australia and the Northern Territory, and that's been reflected in the relative strengths and weaknesses of the capital city property markets. When an economy improves and starts creating jobs again, the first people to notice are people who have businesses. The people earning the big money are the first people to really feel that. And that's one of the main reasons fundamentally why the top end markets tend to move first at the beginning of a growth cycle. So we've seen improvement in the Western Australian economy. There's recovery underway there, and businesses are feeling the benefits of that. And so we've seen some of the million dollar suburbs in Perth starting to move and produce pretty good price growth. Some of them very, very strong price growth. There's some suburbs at the top end of the market in Perth where the median house price has grown by more than 20%, some more than 30%, although with a small sales sample, some of those figures might be a little bit misleading, but there is a pattern there. Now, the same thing is happening in Adelaide, and the South Australian economy is way stronger than most people realise. It's it's an improving economy, a rising economy. It's probably going to get stronger and stronger because there's some big things coming up in the South Australian economy. And as a reflection of that, we've seen a similar thing to what I just mentioned in Perth. There's been a considerable uplift in median prices for some of the millionaire suburbs of Adelaide, those that have median house prices above $1 million. So that's one of the things that is emerging from this research, that some of the smaller cities are rising at the same time as the two biggest cities are in past their peaks, and in some cases seeing some price decline. Canberra's also a pretty solid market. It's got rising momentum, and we're starting to see that reflected in stronger price growth according to some of the research figures that are coming out from some of the research companies. Brisbane, however, remains lukewarm. The Queensland underlying economy continues to be fairly mediocre. There are signals that it's improving and will continue to improve, but as yet that has not delivered strong price growth across the board in Brisbane. Hobart right now is the strongest of the capital city markets, and it's certainly leading capital city Australia on annual price growth at the moment. It's also one of the leaders for rental growth, and one of the reasons for that is it's got the lowest vacancy rate amongst capital city Australia. But the sales volumes figures suggest to me that Hobart's probably past its peak and is going to be gradually winding down from this point. We're still going to see strong price growth because that's the way it works. It's the way the relationship between sales volumes and prices works. It'll take time for the market to react to the fact that Hobart's sales activity, according to the latest numbers anyway, are no longer rising as strongly as they were. Darwin is the one city that just isn't showing any change. It's mired in a downturn with no signs yet of any uplift. Now, while all that's happening in capital city Australia, the forgotten story, if you tap into mainstream media, is what's happening in the regions, because most of the strongest markets in Australia right now are actually in regional Australia. It's been completely ignored by mainstream media, but regional Australia is kind of used to that. It's kind of accustomed to the fact that most of our media comes out of the two biggest cities, and they tend to forget about the rest of Australia, particularly Australia outside the capital cities. But right now, the way we rank markets with this particular research, Adelaide is the leading market, but close behind is regional New South Wales, and close behind regional New South Wales is regional Victoria. They're both regional Victoria and regional New South Wales, according to the research we've done for the Price Predictor Index, have very, very strong markets right across those states. Lots of markets that are rising, and we're seeing that reflected in extraordinary price growth in some cases. Officer and Pakenham in the Cardinia Shire, southeast of Melbourne, they've both had growth in their median house prices well above 20% in the last 12 months. And there's many other locations where that's sign of growth. Newcastle in particular has had very strong growth in New South Wales in its prices. We're also seeing uplift in regional Tasmania. It seems to be a pattern that the capital city winds down, the regional areas crank up, and we suspect that Hobart's past its peak and is winding down, as I mentioned, but various locations in regional Tasmania have very, very strong growth patterns in their sales volumes. And there are also locations in regional Queensland that are doing quite well as well, much better than the capital cities. And it's also worth mentioning that in the Northern Territory, where Darwin is so poor and continues to be, the only growth market in the Northern Territory is actually Alice Springs out in the regions. It's a very solid market. Sales activity is rising, and some of the suburbs there are actually delivering some price growth. So there's a lot more in this report. It's an extensive report. It's a national report. We have sections on all the capital cities, and we have sections on all the regional markets in each of the states and territories. And there's a lot of information there. So I'm not going to try and cover it all in tonight's broadcast. Those are some of the highlights, some of the major headline items, but in coming days and perhaps over the next week, I'll do more broadcasts talking about some of the more specific findings out of this very important research. I say very important because nobody else that I'm aware of actually does the exercise that we do. Everybody else that does research bases their total picture of real estate markets on what's happening with median prices, what's happening with movements in median prices, whether it's annually or quarterly or monthly, or rather foolishly weekly and daily in one notable case, which is rather farcical, but they do it anyway. But it's all historical information. It doesn't really tell you what you need to know as investors, which is where's the next place that's going to grow? Where should we be buying now ahead of the price growth? This exercise actually answers that for you. It tells you where the price growth is going to happen, because what the pattern that we see again and again and again is, first, we have an uplift in sales volumes over a period of 2 or 3 or 4 quarters, and gradually prices react to that, but they don't react instantaneously. And the price reaction continues even after the peak has been reached in markets, the peak in terms of sales activity. And we saw that in Sydney, and we saw that in Melbourne. We've seen that recently in the Central Coast of New South Wales. So if you're not familiar with this report, have a look at it. It's called the Price Predictor Index. The new edition is the Winter 2018 edition, and it's one of our 2 most popular reports on the hotspotting.com.au website. So have a look at it. That's it for now. I'll talk more about it later in the week and in the coming week, because I think it's a really important report, and there's so many different stories revealed by the results of this research. I'll talk more about it in coming days. That's it for now. Terry Ryder from Hotspotting signing off. I will talk to you about this really soon.